Madam President, I also ask unanimous consent to yield back all time on both sides, including the 2 minutes prior to the vote.
Is there objection? Without objection. The question now occurs on the Cadenell.
I ask for the yeas and nays.
Is there a second? There appears to be. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carver. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. King. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell. Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Ms. Stabenow.
Yes.
Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall, Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Walsh. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Brown, Burr, Cardin, Casey, Cochran, Coons, Corker, Donnelly, Feinstein, Fisher, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Heitkamp, Heller, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson of Wisconsin, Klobuchar, Leahy, Lee, Markey, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murphy, Murray, Paul, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rubio, Schatz, Tester, Toomey, Vitter, Walsh, Warner, Warren. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Franken. Aye. Mr. Risch. Aye. Mr. Schumer. Aye. Mr. Crapo. aye. Mr. Sessions. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Johnson. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, aye. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Sanders, aye. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Hatch, aye. Mr. Reed. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Inhofe, aye. Mr. Kane. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mrs. McCaskill. Mrs. McCaskill, aye. Mr. Moran. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Udall. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Coates. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Shelby. Mr. Shelby, aye. Mr. Wyden. Mr. Wyden, aye. Ms. Collins. Ms. Collins, aye. Mr. Scott. Mr. Scott, aye. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Cruz, aye. Mr. Booker. Mr. Booker, aye. Ms. Baldwin. Ms. Baldwin, aye. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wicker, aye. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Flake. Mr. Flake, aye. Mr. Thune. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. King. Mr. King, aye. Mr. Enzi. Mr. Enzi, aye. Ms. Stabenow. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Mr. McCain. Mr. McCain, aye. Ms. Murkowski. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Bozeman. Mr. Bozeman, aye. Ms. Hirono. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, aye. Mr. Kirk. Mr. Kirk, aye. Mrs. Boxer. Mrs. Boxer, aye. Mr. Graham. Mr. Graham, aye. Ms. Cantwell. Ms. Cantwell, aye. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Ayotte, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Chambliss, aye. Mr. Levin. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Udall, Colorado, aye. Mr. Blunt, aye. Mr. Blumenthal, aye. Mrs. Shaheen, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Hoven, aye. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Ms. Landrieu, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye.
Has every senator voted? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not, the yeas are 98, the nays are 0, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote on the Smith nomination.
Madam President.
The senator from California.
Thank you, Madam President. I'll be very brief. I rise to support the nomination of Ambassador Daniel Bennett Smith to be Assistant Secretary of State for Intelligence and Research.
The Senate will be in order.
Ambassador Smith was reported out unanimously from the Intelligence Committee and will, when confirmed, serve as the top intelligence official in the Department of State. He is well qualified, having served for 30 years as Foreign Service Officer in a variety of positions in the State Department. Most recently, he was Ambassador to Greece from 2010 to 2013. This INR is a key position responsible for informing diplomatic decisions with available intelligence and in providing the State Department's input to intelligence decisions. I urge his confirmation. Thank you, President.
Who yields time? All time is yielded back. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin.
Mikulski. You're not.
Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Begich.
In the desk.
Mr. Bennett. Mr. Blumenthal.
Berkeley. Sure. No, we have one more. Reckon. Yes, sir. McConnell. McConnell. Just a minute, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir, I did. Yep. Who was right? Franken. Johnson. Just a moment, just a moment. Johnson. Sure. Do you have any other version? Sure. Yes, sir. Mr. King. Sure. Cochran. I got you, sir. John Brand. You're getting me confused. Not at all. Mr. Booker. Mr. Bozeman. Mrs. Boxer. Gotcha.
I wanted to come one day, I couldn't. No, but I'd be happy to. Well, if I'm not, I'd happy to join.
Mr. Brown.
I gotcha.
Mr. One vote yes.
Mr. Burr. Ms. Cantwell. Mr. Cardin. Mr. Carper. Mr. Casey. Mr. Chambliss. Mr. Coates.
Sessions.
Mr. Coburn. Mr. Cochran. Ms. Collins. Mr. Coons. Mr. Corker. Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham.
Not yet. Thank you.
Yes.
Let's go. Yes, sir.
Better yes.
Okay, got it.
Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller.
I hear that. Ms. Hirono. Portman. Casey. Stabenow. Udall. Kochek. Udall. Manchin. Yeah, I got you. Yes, sir. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu. Mr. McCain. Mr. Scott. Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey.
Yes.
Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray. Mr. Nelson. Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Walsh, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Begich, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Casey, Chambliss, Cochran, Collins, Corker, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Hoven, Isaacson, Johans, Johnson, Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Portman, Pryor, Reed of Nevada, Risch, Roberts, Rubio, Sanders, Schumer, Scott, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Walsh, Warner, Whitehouse, and Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Mr. Burr, aye. Mr. Wicker, aye. I do, sir, yeah. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Mr. Coons, aye. Mr. Heller, aye. Mr. Moran, aye. Mr. Inhofe, Aye. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schatz, aye. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. They're in. Okay. Ms. Warren. Ms. Warren, aye.
Are there any senators in the chamber wishing to vote or change their vote? If not, the yeas are 98, the nays are 0, and the nomination is confirmed.
Madam President,
The Majority Leader.
the next vote will be the last in this series of votes. The next vote, the next one we'll do by voice, and then we'll start a series of votes at 1:45. There could be as many as 11 votes, so everybody cinch up their vests. We'll see what happens. Okay.
Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote on the first Novelli nomination. Who yields time? Who yields time? All time is yielded back. Is there a sufficient second? There appears to be. There is. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso.
Start the vote off. Okay.
Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune.
Coburn and Rockefeller.
Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Walsh, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Ayotte, Baldwin, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Booker, Bozeman, Boxer, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Chambliss, Cochran, Collins, Coons, Crapo, Cruz, Donnelly, Enzi, Flake, Franken, Grassley, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heller, Hoven, Inhofe, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, King, Landrieu, Leahy, Lee, Levin, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Pryor, Risch, Roberts, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Shaheen, Shelby, Stabenow, Toomey, Udall of New Mexico, Vitter, Walsh, Warren, Wicker, and Wyden. No senator voted in the negative. Ms. Hirono, aye. Mrs. Gillibrand, aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado, aye. Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, aye. Mr. Casey, aye. Mrs. Fisher, aye. Mr. McCain, aye. Mr. Graham, aye. Mr. Thune, aye. Mr. Kane, aye. Mr. Markey, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Durbin, Mr. Durbin, aye. Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Feinstein, aye. Mr. Cornyn, aye. Mr. Warner, aye. Mr. Portman, aye. Mr. Coates, aye. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Mr. Brown, aye. Mr. Sessions, aye. Mr. Johans, aye. Mr. Barrasso, aye. Mr. Manchin, aye. Mr. Alexander, aye. Mr. Tester, aye. Ms. Heitkamp, aye. Mrs. Hagan, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Mr. Kirk, aye. Ms. Klobuchar, aye. Mr. Corker, aye.
Have all senators voted? Does any senator wish to change his or her vote? If not on this vote, the yeas are 97, the nays are 0, and the nomination is confirmed. Under the previous order, there will be 2 minutes of debate equally divided in the usual form prior to a vote on the second Novelli nomination. Without objection. The question is on the nomination. All in favor say aye. All opposed, no. The ayes appear to have it. The ayes do have it. The nomination is confirmed.
Madam President.
Under the previous order, the motions to reconsider are considered made and laid on the table. The President will immediately be notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate will resume legislative session. Under the previous order, the time until 1:45 is equally divided. Senator from Arkansas.
Thank you, Madam President. I have a unanimous consent request. I ask unanimous consent that the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the following nominations: calendar number 565 and 570, that the nominations be confirmed en bloc